And now a story from the gospel writer Luke, in the 9th chapter, the 51st and following verses, page 843 in your pew Bibles, if you'd like to follow along. When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers ahead of him. On their way, they entered a village of Samaritans to make ready for him. But they did not receive him because his face was set toward Jerusalem. When his disciples James and John saw it, they said, "Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" But he turned and rebuked them. And then they went on to another village. As they were going along the road, someone said to him, "I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." To another he said, "Follow me." But he said, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." But Jesus said to him, "Let the dead bury their own dead. But as for you, go and proclaim the kingdom of God." Another said, "I will follow you, Lord, but let me first say farewell to those at my home." Jesus said to him, "No one puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God."
In the midst of preparing this sermon on Thursday, the image flashed across my computer screen of a young man and a little girl laying face down in shallow water of a riverbed. You probably saw the same picture. Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez, his wife, and their young daughter, Valeria, made their way to the U.S. border from El Salvador, hoping to claim asylum. And due to the long waits put upon asylum seekers by the metering process that the U.S. government is now instituting, they decided to cross the Rio Grande River and come into the U.S. to claim asylum. And Oscar had gotten Valeria, his toddler daughter, across the river, and he had gone back for his wife when Valeria started to enter the water again. So Oscar rushed back to save her and to get her back onto dry ground, and they were both swept up by the river and drowned with the little toddler clinging to her father's neck. And I left my office and walked out to Mass Ave to make my way to a meeting, passing by all of the tourists eating their ice cream cones on the sidewalk on a hot Cambridge day. And I was overwhelmed with the disjointed nature of these two scenes. A father and daughter face down in a river, further casualties of our immigration system, and tourists and Cantabrigians enjoying their ice cream on Mass Ave. I was almost made physically dizzy by the juxtaposition of this scene. But the lectionary text this week started to make a bit more sense. The passage from the Gospel of Luke is the outset of Luke's journey narrative in the Gospel. It takes Jesus from Galilee to Jerusalem. It's a journey that the Gospel writer Mark takes in one chapter. But Luke makes this journey narrative span over 400 verses and 10 chapters of his book. And as they got going, the first place they came to for a little rest was a Samaritan village, but they got no reception there. And the disciples were outraged. And hearkening back to the story of that great old Hebrew prophet Elijah, who was taken up in the whirlwind in today's lectionary text, his battle with the prophets of Baal, where he called down fire to devour the prophets and the sacrifice, the disciples turned to Jesus and said, "Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" And he rebuked them and moved on. And as they went, 3 potential followers approached. "I will follow you wherever you go," one of them said. And Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." And he turned to another and said, "Follow me." But the would-be disciple said, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." But Jesus said to him, Let the dead bury their own dead. But as for you, go and proclaim the kingdom of God. And another said, I'll follow you, Lord, but let me first say farewell to those at my home. And Jesus said to him, no one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God. And it all calls into question what it really means to follow Jesus. That simplest of designations for what it means to be a Christian, a follower of Jesus. And put into perspective by the deaths of Oscar and Valeria Ramirez this week, it's hard to miss the fact that this journeying of Jesus was replete with rejection. This journey that Luke thinks is so important that it takes 10 chapters to spin out is full of rejection. From the very outset, he was denied hospitality in the Samaritan village. And readers of the gospel know that at the end of the journey, once they finally arrive, 10 chapters later in the book of Luke, the end awaiting him is death. And thinking together about Jesus and the disciples journeying about 85 miles from Galilee to Jerusalem may help us to see today the hundreds and hundreds of miles of journeying undertaken by migrants to the U.S. border as a Christological sign. There's a manifestation of Christ taking shape at the border right now. A young father and his daughter face down in a riverbed, children taken from their parents and warehoused in cages, sleeping on concrete floors. 7 children this year so far dying in U.S. custody. Long journeys, inhospitality, rejection, death. I don't just mean that these are metaphorically similar to Jesus' journey. I mean that if there is a manifestation of Christ in our midst today, and that is quite a question in the U.S., if there is a manifestation of Christ in our midst today, it is in these bodies on our border. Pediatrician who visited the centers where the children are being held this month said that they could be compared to what he called torture facilities. A group of lawyers visited the Customs and Border Protection facility in Clint, Texas, finding children who were not bathed for weeks, toddlers without diapers, sick babies cared for by other children. And you've probably heard enough about this to be sick to your stomach about it. In the book that the deacons and the team leaders are reading together this summer by Gil Rendell called Quietly Courageous, I came across this passage that really struck me as I was kind of dealing with my own concerns surrounding these overwhelming pictures of suffering and death. Rendell says, if pain provides motivation, possibility provides direction. If pain provides motivation, possibility provides direction. The reality is that pain without possibility is debilitating. To face into one's pain without any hope to move beyond it incapacitates both the individual and the organization. Yet, false hopes and easy answers to pain short-circuit the future by allowing the organization to recognize the situation but remain complacent, believing that the situation will be cared for simply with patience or easy steps. It is denial and work avoidance. Pain without possibility is debilitating. False hopes and easy answers short-circuit the future. Patience and easy steps will not move us beyond the status quo. Political scientist and professor of human rights and attorney Cody Cronin-Furman noted in a New York Times article that she published yesterday that our efforts to address what she sees as a scholar of human rights violations as a mass atrocity, which has a particular designation about what that means and what has to take place in order for something to be considered a mass atrocity. And she sees what's happening at our border as a mass atrocity that will take more than our typical efforts at political protesting and calling our legislators. She harkens back to an earlier period, which I found really interesting, of mass atrocity for lessons that we might learn in our own efforts to address what is taking place. She talks about the situation in Denmark during World War II. She says that in the situation in Denmark, strong social pressure, including from the churches, contributed to the refusal of the country to comply with Nazi orders to deport its Jewish citizens. Now, here's the important part of what she's pointing to here. This was not strong social pressure of politicians. This was pressure on the foot soldiers and bureaucratic middlemen, the people who were in the neighborhood, who were in the churches, the people whose names you don't know and don't see on the news. This pressure on these sort of low-level foot soldiers and bureaucratic middlemen caused many of them to stop participating in the violence against their Jewish neighbors, because they weren't doing this with strong ideological promptings. They were doing this because it was their 9-to-5 job. They got paid to do it. She goes on about this story. When the Nazis revealed their plan to deport the entire Jewish population of Denmark, the leaders of the Danish church sent an open letter to German officials that was read from every pulpit to the whole nation on October the 3rd, 1943. It read in part, quote, "Wherever Jews are persecuted because of their religion or race, it is the duty of the Christian church to protest against such persecution, because it is in conflict with the sense of justice inherent in the Danish people and inseparable from our Danish Christian culture. We understand religious freedom as the right to exercise our worship of God as our vocation and conscience bids us, and in such a manner that race and religion per se can never justify that a person be deprived of his rights, freedom, or property. Our different religious views notwithstanding, we shall fight for the cause that our Jewish brothers and sisters may persevere and preserve the same freedom which we ourselves evaluate more highly than life itself." Read from every pulpit in Denmark. And then, you probably know some of this story, they collaborated to hide their Jewish neighbors until they could be evacuated to nearby Sweden. This was an effort organized by hundreds of regular private citizens working together and collecting funds for the effort. And it wasn't so straightforward how they did it. Listen to some of these details. On the night of the rescue effort, all German patrol ships in the area were docked for repairs, which was not coincidental. The citizens who had gotten to know some of the soldiers bribed them to dock the ships for repair so that they could make their escape on board fishing boats. Now, the fishermen were so poor that they couldn't take a day off to carry Jewish citizens to Sweden, or they would risk not being able to feed their families. So the money that the Danish citizens collected was given to the fishermen for their efforts so that they could support their families and participate in this resistance effort to move their Jewish neighbors to safety. In the end, the Nazis were only successful in deporting 580 Jews of the 7,000 Jews that lived in Denmark. Social pressure on friends and neighbors resulted in many little cogs in the wheel refusing to operate the machinery of evil any longer. Cronin-Furman also points to the need to pressure corporations, one of the most powerful entities in our neo-colonial world today, to pressure corporations to end complacency in the mechanizations of evil. She points to the Wayfair walkout that happened this week. You may have seen pictures of it happening in Copley Square here in Boston, when employees walked out en masse protesting their company's supplying of furniture and bedding materials to the border detention camps that were keeping migrants in detention. And enabling, through the purchase and supply of simple furniture, enabling the mechanisms of evil through the supply of furniture. And the employees refused to participate in it any longer. Katie Cronin-Furman says, so far, This is an important word for us right now, folks. She says, so far, mobilization against what's happening on the border has mostly followed standard political activism scripts, raising public awareness, organizing protest, phoning our congressional representatives. These efforts are critical, she says, but they aren't enough. Children are suffering and dying. The fastest way to stop it is to make sure that everyone who is responsible faces consequences. Social pressure on normal people. Refusal to participate in the mechanizations of evil. It's easy enough to read ourselves into these three gospel stories, kind of putting ourselves symbolically into the characters that Luke portrays here, imagining our responses to these three invitations. Sometimes I do think we feel like Jesus, like we have some sense of purpose on this journey that we're making together, knowing the good we need to do in the way of compassion and peace and justice, but living in a milieu intent on thwarting every effort to make headroads in these directions. Oftentimes, you know this, we feel like the disciples following Jesus, witnessing rejections of his ways of compassion and peace and justice, wishing that we could call down fire upon our enemies, not sure what we're supposed to do about all that we see taking place around us. Most of the time, though, we're the Samaritans. Living life within the U.S. empire doesn't allow us to easily escape this association, no matter what we stand for. We live in the empire that represents the rejection of the ways of compassion and peace and justice. We can't get out of that association in this story. But Luke wants us to imagine ourselves as one of these three would-be followers of Jesus. And there's something important in these very few little verses here that we easily gloss over with some aggrandized notion of the radical cost of discipleship. But in fact, these choices that these three would-be disciples face in their decision to follow Jesus are not dramatic at all. There's no dramatic choice that they are asked to make here. As Fred Craddock says about this passage, the radicality of Jesus' words lies in his claim to priority over the best, not the worst, of human relationships. Jesus never said to choose him over the devil, but to choose him over the family. To the one who wanted to follow and gave no excuse why he couldn't, Jesus said, man, there's not going to be any place on this road that you'll find a warm welcome. Maybe he saw in the man's eyes that rejection was going to be too much for him to handle. And another, invited along the journey, just needed to take care of his father's affair, to bury his father, he said. Another asked to join along the road and said, just let me run back and say goodbye to my family. And neither of these good, wholesome, perfectly understandable needs seemed a suitable reason not to drop everything and go at that very moment. And in the end, we don't know what these three did. Luke leaves these stories open-ended. We don't know what decisions they made. The radicality of Jesus' words, Craddock says, lies in his claim to priority over the best, not the worst, of human relationship. Jesus never said to choose him over the devil, but to choose him over the family. And I ask myself quite often if what I'm currently doing in the face of all that is taking place around me is really the best that I could be doing in the face of what is taking place around me. And I am not yet satisfied with the answer to that question. It is a question of ongoing discernment. And it's one invited by this passage for us this morning. The outset of a journey narrative raising the question for all of us just what it means to follow Jesus. Pain without possibility is debilitating. False hopes and easy answers short-circuit the future. Patience and easy steps will not move us beyond the status quo. The choices for most of us are never between the worst evil and the best good, but between a good and a better good. So I have 3 invitations I want to issue you today. These are invitations to collaborate on some things. One is that as I was coming into the church this morning, thinking about this public witness we have had on the front lawn on Mass Ave for over a year now, the mass shooting cross, where we noted every mass shooting that took place in the U.S. in 2018 and held a communal vigil attended by people from all over Cambridge on Good Friday to mark this particular form of evil that is unique to the U.S. It has been a powerful witness. People from all over the world pass by this church every day. I have flyers out there explaining the cross. I make 50 flyers at a time and put them in the box, and I replenish them every couple of weeks. Hundreds of people have taken the flyers that explain why this congregation did that public witness, bringing attention to the issue of mass shootings in the U.S. It has been powerful. Now I want you to help me think about what's next. Because the mass shootings cross has sort of run its course here. We've intended to have it up from Good Friday to Good Friday, which we did, and we've left it up for a little while longer. The Spiritual Life team has plans to use that cross in worship in the future, which means we're going to take it off of the lawn. What might we do outside that is a public witness to our friends and neighbors, and literally people from all over the world, that says something about the mass atrocities taking place at the border? Help me dream and imagine about what that public witness might be. Something visible, arresting, easily understandable. Something that sends a message about what we stand for as a community and invites others to stand with us in that regard. It's the first invitation. It's a longer-term project for us to think about. The second is to think carefully and critically about the work we do here. I've tried to issue this invitation in a variety of ways over the last year or so. Some of those have gone very well and have produced really interesting thought about what we're doing. Some have been met with a lot of resistance because what we're already doing is good. Why do we need to think about some other way of doing good? But I want to invite you to think about that, because this is a new era. And it requires new kinds of action from a church that stands for compassion and peace and justice and is really willing to risk something to follow Jesus. Think about that on the teams that you serve on. Think about that as deacons. Think about that at coffee shop office hours, at pub office hours, with the people that you gather with on a daily basis. Let us be generative and creative in the ways we imagine following Jesus in this particular era in our life and world. The third invitation is immediate. The whole notion of pain without possibility got me thinking about what we needed today to address some of the pain that we have been experiencing this week and beyond, particularly in the images of Oscar and Valeria Ramirez lying face down in the river. So during the silence that follows the sermon, I was very serious about this being a Christological sign. These two bodies laying face down in the river being the image of Christ in our midst. So I've printed pictures, 2 of them, of Oscar and Valeria and a grieving wife and mother. And I'm going to put them on the altar here, one on each side. And I invite you during the silence, as you are moved, if you would like, if you feel like this would be an important action for you, to come forward and place your hands on these pictures, to pray in silence for this family and for every family that these 2 bodies represent. And because pain without possibility instills a sort of lethargy and hopelessness, I'm also going to put on the altar table a list of 5 or 6 ways that a friend of mine, Lindsay Popperson, UCC minister in Boston, posted on Facebook that she sort of collected from a variety of places. These are particular, actionable ways to do something, not everything, but to do something to help with the situation at the border. So as you come forward and pray for this family and all that they represent, you can also take one of these and take it home with you, share it with people, and actually do something in the immediate short term as we continue to think about our larger, longer-term explorations of how we follow Jesus in the ways of compassion, peace, and justice. So in the silence now, I invite you to come.